Hello, nerds. I'm here with Katie Dolan, who is OG Yang Gang, but also led comms for the Dean Phillips campaign. And she and I spent some quality time in New Hampshire, driving to diners and senior centers and doing all kinds of good campaign work to try and give people choices. So I was so delighted that Katie, you agreed to come on to the Nerd Show and talk about broader things, but we'll certainly touch on New Hampshire as well. How are you?
I'm doing great. And thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a long time watcher, so thrilled to now be making my debut.
Long overdue, Katie. Long overdue. Well, let's start at the beginning. Like, how did you get into doing comms stuff? Was that something you knew you wanted to do, like in college, and you pursued it, or how did it happen?
In college, I was very convinced that I would be finishing up my PhD in physics right now. So definitely not where I thought I'd be when I started pursuing my degree. I have a degree in physics, actually, bachelor's, nothing that exciting, from Fordham University. And from there, as I was going through things, I realized research and time in the lab wasn't quite the right fit for my personality and what I wanted out of life. And so as much as I loved physics, I switched into tech, like so many people do. Mm-hmm. And while working at a tech startup, I stumbled on an event where Andrew Yang was speaking. I heard him speak, and immediately I said, "I'm going to work for you." He said he couldn't pay me. I said, "That's not a problem." And so I started volunteering for the campaign. From there, I started working full time towards the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. So pretty early. I think I was one of the first dozen folks on the campaign.
Yeah.
I didn't start out in communications there either. I was doing, like so many people on the early Yang campaign, we were all doing a lot of different things, and none of it was where we ended up. But after some work in scheduling, in policy research, and things like that, I slowly made my way to communications, and that's what ended up sticking.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wouldn't have expected to transition from physics to comms. Do you find like some similarities in some ways, or are they just completely different?
Well, I think that a really important fundamental of communications is understanding what you're talking about. And so it's not necessarily a one-to-one with physics itself, but certainly the research aspect. I spend a lot of my day just reading and listening to people and taking in information and then processing that information and trying to figure out the best way to tell stories with that information. And in that way, it's actually very related to the research aspect of the sciences. And now, as I work also in tech communications, there's certainly some elements there that overlap. But then I was also a big theater kid for my whole life. I did a lot of theater in college. I worked off Broadway in college. And so I think that there's a stronger parallel there.
Yeah, I love it. What a Renaissance woman you are, physics and theater. That's great.
I'm certainly something. Whether I'm good at any of them is still up for debate.
Well, I still remember struggling with AP physics in high school, and I was like, that's the last physics class I'm taking.
I tapped out after quantum. That's where they started to lose me.
Yeah, it's a different breed of student that does lots of physics. Well, so you went to the Yang campaign, and then after the Yang the presidential wound down, did you get involved in the mayoral as well?
I did not. I actually at first started working for a PR firm in the tech space, going back to my startup roots. There was, a pandemic brewing. And so the pressure to find work after the campaign was pretty intense and a little scary. And I think for anyone thinking about a career in politics, the one thing I would warn you is it can be volatile, and to make sure that you prepare yourself just for the ups and the downs and how do you navigate the next step, because it's not always an easy one to navigate. But once things settled down with the pandemic, I started working with some old friends from the Yang campaign, two other folks from the communications program that we had there. And we launched a firm, which was great. And we got to support a lot of really cool candidates throughout the years. We ended up no longer working together, just as life happens. But I really will always treasure that time and the campaigns we got to do together.
Yeah, and what's the biggest difference between doing comms for political campaigns versus communications for tech startups, let's say? Are there a lot of similarities, or are they very different?
The fundamentals are always the same. We're here to tell a story. That is fundamentally my job, is to communicate effectively whatever the narrative is that the brand or individual that I'm working with wants to tell. That said, the landscape's completely different. The pacing is wildly different. You don't see startups having to put out nearly as many statements as politicians do. And also the way that you engage with people is very different. The goals of each of these organizations is night and day compared to political work.
So let's talk about what it's like leading communications for a political campaign. If you had asked me from an outsider's point of view, I would have imagined, oh, there's like tons of planning and strategizing. I think one thing I noticed in New Hampshire was just the rapid response, unplanned things that just pop up. What is it like, being in that seat?
I think it's one of the most exciting jobs in the world, but I'm also very biased. We should be doing strategy. Fundamentally, my job when I'm a communications director is to map out the strategy for a campaign. With every campaign, it's a little different, depending on your staffing, depending on your candidate. The way I like to look at things, you kind of have two different ends of a spectrum for candidates. On the one hand, you have people who are very interested in, give me the talking points. What's the data saying? How should I be appealing to the party even, or certain voters. And they're looking more for heavy talking points, not quite parrot points, but they want a little bit more control from their communications team. So a more communications led program. But then on the other side of things, and these are the candidates I tend to be drawn to, you have the folks who are much more engaged in authenticity, in really owning their own brand. And so they're coming to me looking more for, here are all of the different things we could be doing. And here's what would happen depending on which levers we pull. And here's the anticipated outcomes and all of that. Here's what I would recommend. But at the end of the day, it's their decision. It's their name, it's their image, it's their likeness. They're the ones that are going out there. Dean was certainly one of those candidates. Yang is certainly one of those candidates, where it's much more advising and then reacting, and really trying to get a full lay of the land of the possible outcomes and the possible different spark points, and then moving forward from there. It allows you to be a little more nimble. It allows you to be a little more authentic. It's certainly more challenging and oftentimes involves many more late nights. But at the end of the day, I think that, and you hear Zach talk about this all the time, and I know he's been on this podcast before, the attention economy, breaking through there, I think requires a degree of authenticity that if you aren't having a more nimble communications program, you're not going to break through. You're not going to do it. And so that's something that I really try to find when I'm looking at candidates that I want to work for, is that willingness to engage authentically and to be a little bit more opportunistic, if you will. Yeah.
Let's talk about some examples, Katie. So for the Yang presidential, what do you think was one of the high points from a comms perspective, and then one of the really challenging kind of times? And we can kind of unpack a little bit about some potential learnings from that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, certainly I think, started to hit on really key and core messaging that was resonating with a lot of folks. Obviously, UBI was incredibly critical to what we were doing and how we were framing things, but tapping into also this understanding that not everything is perfect in America. And we were doing it in a more gentle way than how Trump often does it. But the reality is that so many Americans are struggling, don't feel like things are going okay, are worried about their children. And these are all very real fears, and they're fears that many politicians do touch on. But I think that we really managed to do it in a very authentic way, that was able to draw people in. And it was both by quantifying it with numbers, which Andrew was so good at, and leaning into his brain there, but then also through the human moments where Andrew really allowed who he was to shine and to provide that connection with people. And I think that was really, really critical. And so those moments, and it's hard to pinpoint one, but thinking back to when he was crying at the gun control rally, like that was really emotional and a really key moment in showing how human he was and how human we all are. And I think that was really important. And then I think flip side, some of the moments that didn't go so well were when we maybe stepped over the line and were too authentic. I think about all the time the tweet that dominated my first few weeks on the campaign, which is when Andrew commented on circumcision. And, just that was all people wanted to talk to him about. We were at a conference and TMZ came up to us. It was the first conference I ever attended. I wasn't actually even working at a communications capacity at the time, but I was navigating TMZ, chasing him down the steps of the National Action Network's conference that was happening. It was just wild. It was a crazy time. And so certainly there's a double-edged sword to being authentic.
Yeah, I mean, that is not a common topic for candidates to discuss. I guess I also feel like the press kind of maybe wanted to pick up on these zany topics. They didn't want to hear him talking about, entitlements or climate.
I mean, the press understands, and I don't mean this in any sort of disparaging way. The press understands what's going to get eyeballs. The press is there to ensure. Right now, the landscape in media is really hard. I would never want to actually be in a lot of journalists' shoes with the layoffs that are happening. I don't know if you're following what's happening at the Washington Post, but all of the issues going on with leadership there. And in general, where we are in terms of media landscape now versus 4 years ago versus 4 years before that is kind of horrifying. There's been a huge gutting of both press at the local level and the national level. It's a very pressing issue. And of course, this is also happening at a time where trust in these institutions is really starting to lower. And then on top of it all, we have this disinformation, misinformation, turning to social media for a lot of our news. And it's just creating a very complicated environment. And so when press have the opportunity to talk about something that they know people will listen to, they're going to do it. And you can't.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of, it wasn't quite, I mean, maybe it's so funny talking about circumcision, but it wasn't quite like that. But in New Hampshire, I do remember that picture of Congressman Phillips, standing by the van or whatever,
God,
getting so much interest. And I was like, wow, I've been here, just for a couple of weeks, but we're doing like multiple things per day. Like, this is the thing that everybody wants to talk about.
Yeah. And, later that day, we had a huge attendance at another event.
Yeah.
I think this really does sort of speak to the power, the sharp power, but also the huge downside to communications. Narrative building is so important. And when you have a narrative that clicks, it's really hard to get it to unclick.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the candidate who's floundering in New Hampshire, who thought that he could face Biden, but really can't, was a lot more interesting than the candidate who's, starting to gain ground. Starting to gain ground is nowhere near as interesting as a national laughingstock, which is so unfortunate, but the reality that we found ourselves in.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just, I do remember Congressman Phillips talking about later, like, hey, the reporter that put that out, he was rewarded by media, like social media interest, and he got tons and tons of likes and shares and whatever. And then that same reporter covered the senior center bingo game, and that post didn't get any action. Yep. So the incentives are clear.
Well, and I actually don't even know that that's the incentives on the reporter's part necessarily. embeds in particular, their job is to be there and record everything. And then, their editors look at things and they take what they will and they put it into the news cycle. But embeds primarily, if you looked at Jake's Twitter feed, that was the reporter, or any of our other embeds, they were recording everything that they were at and they were documenting it. And it was the national conscious that really took a hold of that story and decided, this is funny, we're going to talk about this. And that's the attention economy. What's funny? What's engaging?
Yeah.
Is it bingo? Bingo's not that funny.
Yeah, it's so true. Well, when you think about sort of the high points and more difficult points of the Dean campaign, what comes to mind from a comms perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest struggle I think we all had on that campaign is we started and it was already practically election day.
Yeah.
And it's really, really, really hard to build a plane that fast with any hopes of having it fly, let alone land. And so that was a strong pain point for a lot of us. Also, a lot of us were brought in a little bit later in the cycle. And so we were picking up what someone had already started building, but they built it very differently than how we would build it. And so figuring out where all those pieces were, what actually mattered, trying to navigate that landscape was very, very challenging at first. And I think really slowed us down at a time that we needed to be moving quickly. And then high points, personally, being able to really roll out a Medicare for All policy is something that I will always treasure having been able to do. That is certainly a policy very near and dear to my heart. And while I don't ever like putting my own views onto a candidate, because I do believe that my job is to be the outside counsel. I'm not the one running. It was really, really wonderful to be afforded an opportunity to work on something like that, especially with the individuals we were able to work on it with.
Yeah, no, I definitely put up 1 or 2 Medicare for All placards at various events. I think Taylor can attest to. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen in candidates that works. Like for people out there who are saying, "Hey, maybe someday I'll run for office." What's your advice to them? My inclination is like, don't do it. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Don't do it isn't bad advice. I think much like we do it all the time with actors. And I know that this is more my background than it is anyone else's. But we often tell people when they're trying to go into acting school or school for the arts in general, if there's anything you could do other than this profession, then you should do it. Because this is such a high effort, low reward sort of career. And I think that that's really true of politics. I think additionally, you really do need to believe strongly in what you're doing, and you need to believe that you can win. You will be up 7 days a week for 20 hours a day at some points in the election, and you're going to hate yourself. You're going to hate everyone around you. You are going to feel like a shell of a human being. You will be making choices that you wouldn't normally make. And afterwards, that's going to really hurt. Looking back on that time, it's going to be painful. Running a race is really, really hard. It's one of the most difficult things I've ever done. Not that I've done all that much, but certainly it's a very, very challenging proposition. And so if you don't believe that you can win, you're not going to win. There's no hope for you. You've already lost. So I think having that conviction is really important. Loving this country, absolutely critical. And I know that that should go without saying, but if you're running for office because you think it could be a cool career move, don't do it. Public service, it is service. And so really embrace that ideal. And then I also think it's important to have a point of view, to really understand your community, to know what it is that you can bring that's different from everyone else that would benefit your neighbors, and having that care for your neighbors and the willingness to listen and to be criticized. You're in the public eye, and that is so immensely challenging. I remember looking at both Andrew and Dean and so many other politicians I've worked with and seeing them sometimes crumple under public pressure. Twitter is a scary place when everyone hates you. You know, it's not fun to be receiving death threats online. And that's a very real possibility when you're running for office. And so if you're not prepared for that, And it's okay if you're not. This might not be the right path for you.
Yeah, I was on a hike with a buddy of mine in Yosemite last week, and we were doing some thought exercises, and he said, "Oh, would you ever consider running for office?" And I was like, "Well, I'm definitely a politics junkie."
Totally.
The thought has crossed my mind, but I I worry about whether or not like I would actually have any impact even if I won anything. You look at these people in Congress and you're like, man, they're not getting a lot done. And I'm curious, like, how do you think about the ROI for, if your goal is to help the country, is that the best way to help the country?
I think about that question almost every day. I think that the KPIs we have for our executive and legislative branches are probably a little bit off. And I think we often don't see a good return on investment. If I were treating the government like a startup, which I don't think that you should do. I think the government and business are two separate things for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were, it's not a very good startup. And I do think, and this is something that I believe you've alluded to on your podcast in the past, and that I think is a really critical issue that we should all be talking about more. Granted, I'm biased because I am a big Yang supporter, but this idea that the American government, as it's currently structured now, is fundamentally flawed. And it's okay that it's fundamentally flawed. We are in the oldest democracy in the entire world, one of the oldest continuous governments in the entire world. Of course, it's not perfect. That would be ridiculous. So many other governments have taken our model, started up, tweaked things to be better for them. And that's important. That change is important. Also looking at what the founders wanted. So many people love to talk about what the founding fathers wanted. Thomas Jefferson thought we should redo our government once a generation. When have we ever done that? I think that there's a real need for some hard looks at how we're structured, because until we start addressing that, I think we're going to be stuck for a long time.
Yeah, I am with you on the kind of root cause analysis and trying to improve the kind of foundations of how things work. I'm curious, like, if you care about like gerrymandering reform and open primaries and different forms of voting and campaign finance reform, if those let's say that you believe that, okay, that's the way you help the country because then it'll be better able to solve hard problems down the road. What's the best way to advocate for that? Because my buddy was like, oh, well, isn't the best way then to volunteer for a think tank versus showing up in Congress and just arguing and raising money all the time?
I think, and we see this a lot of times with laws even now, you can think about a law a decade and it can still get derailed. So thinking isn't going to solve our problems. It's going to actually really take some strong individuals running for office, but first at the local level. I think, and I certainly am one to talk here, working on 2 presidential campaigns and things of that nature, but local elections matter so much. You can do so much at the state level, and that's where you have to start. The reality is, you're absolutely right. One congressperson is not going to totally change the shape of our nation. Maybe a very maverick president could, but the reality is, if once again we go back to the original structure of the Constitution, the executive branch has a lot more power right now than it was originally given, and that could definitely be rolled back by a particularly rambunctious Supreme Court, who also has so much more power than is explicitly written in the Constitution, bringing us to yet another issue with the Constitution. But I would say it's so important to pay attention to what's happening at the local level, to what's happening at the state level, and to start building from the ground up. And I do think that we saw the Republicans do a great job of this over the last 2 decades, building out their bench, really thinking through how they're going to take over these local governments, these state governments, and look at where it led us. So if you want to start enacting change, start local.
Great advice. And when you say local, do you mean like city council or do you mean state assembly? Like how local?
All levels of government, even your school boards. I think book bans, how we're treating LGBTQ youth in schools. That happens at the school board level. That's still an elected position. Really, it's important to be invested in your community at every level. And that investment is hard. There's no way around it. Building a community is not an easy thing to do, but that's where we start laying the groundwork for real change.
Love it. Katie, we have to talk about the present day.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get your thoughts. There's a debate next week. What are your predictions on the Trump versus Biden rematch on CNN?
I will certainly have some popcorn. I can tell you that much. There's a world where there won't be fireworks. You know, I think that we all have to acknowledge both elephants in the room, and that's that it's two 80-ish-year-old men who are about to, in some cases, hobble onto the stage and try to string together sentences. I'm being a little mean and facetious here, but I do think that there's a world where this debate is really slow and really boring and fails to capture the attention of a lot of people if neither man is exactly as cogent as they should be. And we all know that that is a possibility. That said, both teams seem to be putting in a lot of effort. I know CNN had a piece about it recently. And I do think that the Biden administration understands what is on the line with this debate. I think that they're correct in their assessment that right now people aren't paying attention to this race yet in a meaningful way. I think they did themselves a disservice by not having an appropriate primary. I think that could have drawn a lot of attention to this race a lot sooner. So we wouldn't be in June ahead of a very critical election going, oh yeah, I guess there's a presidential election in November. A lot of folks I'm talking to don't know that there's a debate on Thursday, and they should be really worried about that because I know that they are relying on what's happening in this debate to wake folks up. They could still do that, even if there aren't a lot of eyeballs on the debate, if they have a few really key moments that they're able to clip, put on social, really start using the content machine that they should have been building up over the last 4 years to distribute that content. They could still be in a good spot, but that means they need to deliver those moments, those clippable moments. And sometimes people are hard to clip if they're rambling and not focusing on what they need to be focusing on.
Yeah, let's play a game here where you make believe you are the comms director for the Biden campaign and you're preparing for Thursday. Like, what's the game plan that you would advocate for to help Joe, get those clippable moments that are positive?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, it's going to be critical that at every turn they remind the American people what's at stake in this election. I think drawing upon a lot of Trump's weaker points and probably shying away from Biden's weaker moments will be very critical. Having a few rebuttals at the ready, I think, could really solidify things for them. And I know that they said no back and forth at this debate. I've never watched a debate where there's not a back and forth. They say that at every debate. They say you're going to answer the question and then you're going to move on, and nobody ever does it. So I think really showcasing that Biden is sharp, able to quickly respond to things will be critical. So thinking through what is it that Trump might bring up? What is it that Trump might not be prepared for? Leaning into key issues that matter to a lot of voters, although I don't think focusing on, for example, I think that there are some real cracks in the Republican Party right now. We've seen with the recent Southern Baptist Conference putting out a statement on IVF that could prove to be really divisive for the Republican Party. I don't think leaning into anything like that is going to help them in this particular debate, though I do think that will be an interesting topic down the line. But focusing on things like, oh gosh, what did Biden do well recently? Focusing on things like the climate and the ways that they've made strides there, focusing on any sort of relief efforts they've done for the American people. They're walking a very dangerous road right now where the economy is not going to be a strong point for them. While certainly inflation is better than it was, a year ago, people don't feel like things are going that well. And so the economy is not a winning message in this moment. And I really hope that they don't try to make it one. I think that oftentimes Democrats have relied on, Oh, well, but if you look at the bigger picture, it's going great. And that doesn't matter if you're having a hard time putting food on the table. That's not a winning message. That won't resonate with voters.
So what a difficult hand to play. Um, you can't talk if you're Biden, you really can't talk up the economy to your point because people are going to find it inauthentic or kind of inconsistent with their lived experience. You
I do think it
can't.
will win with political pundits if they frame it
Okay.
correctly, but that doesn't help them with who they really need to be reaching.
Yeah. So maybe you can get some points with some pundits on the economy, but for the most part, it's a dangerous, like thin ice there.
it's, a,
Um,
it's a tough thread to
yeah. And
weave through.
then one of your biggest achievements is around climate, but a lot of moderates or kind of, Republicans uncomfortable with Trump are not going to respond super positively to spending hundreds of billions of dollars on climate. They might actually find that, too extreme or whatever.
I mean, flip
Or,
side, I do think that there was a recent New York Times article that came out. A lot of those climate dollars are going to creating jobs specifically in Republican states. And so
mhm.
there's something there, I think. Although
Okay.
to the point, climate is often a tough one. It's a tough
Yeah.
sell,
Yeah. So
unfortunately.
then, So he would have to land it around, hey, there's because of the IRA, there's these new things going on in these states. So then he would have to rattle off some facts in a confident way and not get the states wrong, which is hard if you're stressed out and also not good at that.
It's facts and then it's also stories. I think that the
Hmm.
one thing that Biden has always been so wonderful at, and it's once again the thing that I care most about in a candidate, is how authentically they can connect with people. And
Hmm.
Biden has long been an incredible connector of human beings. He can
Yep.
tell an excellent story. He can really make you feel things and he can make you feel like he understands. And so if there are moments that they're able to weave that in, I think that would be a huge win for the Biden team.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I find Biden as a person to come across as very authentic and well-meaning. I don't want to say well-intentioned. I know that's a loaded phrase there. But like he seems like a good guy,
Yeah.
like a grandpa, who really cares. But I don't know
Another
if he
tough
should be
comparison. Yeah.
I don't know if he should be running like the largest country in the world kind of thing, but okay, so our advice to Biden is you got to thread the needle on the economy, you got to tie the IRA to job creation and affordability, and you got to be on your you got to kind of avoid a senior moment. That's the
Yeah.
other thing, right?
Oh, he has to avoid senior moments and he has to exude strength and control. I do think that they achieved it very nicely at the State of the Union. I
Yeah.
think that anyone watching that would
Yeah.
say, okay, this is a leader. And that's really
Hmm.
critical. They have to do that again. I think that he can do it. I certainly hope he can do it more than I think he can do it. I really hope he does it. But I think that that will absolutely be critical. And I will say, just while we're on this messaging topic, I do think it's important to call out that the Democrats are in consistently a more challenging position on messaging than Republicans. A lot of times, especially if you've worked in communications at various levels of Democratic establishment, people will say, man, Democrats messaging, we have to solve that problem. It's really, really hard. And Dan Pfeiffer actually wrote a piece on this, an opinion piece, and it was in his book. We as Democrats are trying to encapsulate such a large section of America. And I don't just mean racially, age wise, location wise, any of those things. I mean, politically speaking, Democrats right now are the big tent party. We have moderates, we have
Hmm.
center right people, we have center left people, we have very left people. And so trying to find a winning message that actually hits all those demographics, it is impossible. There's no one message that's going to do that. You can try all you want. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. And so they frequently have to balance all of these
Hmm.
different contending factors. How do I speak to this group? How do I speak to this group? Am I over indexing? And that's wildly challenging. And that is an unfortunate handicap that the Democrats have faced consistently over the last 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, and you could argue at least maybe 10 years ago, the Republican Party had different factions, but it seems like Trump just turned his back on the kind of like Rockefeller Republicans. Like that doesn't really exist anymore in the party. That was, I guess, the strategy that he took. He went with the red meat wing.
And they don't exist, but they do. And I think that honestly, you and I might be sitting at the intersection of that now with there's a big new money interest in Trump. The VC space is much more interested than they were 4 years ago or 8 years ago. Obviously, the All In podcast interviewed Trump the other day, and there are frequent articles coming up in places like The Information. I believe the Journal had a piece on it too, where VCs are really starting to court Trump, and he's getting that muddied interest back. And okay, yeah, it's not the blue bloods that it was before, but I think that there is a shift in who he's appealing to. I think maybe some of it is the fact that he always has been such a straight shooter, and he's just saying what he's saying, unfortunately. And while I think that it has alienated some really important people for the Democrats who needed it to be alienating, it's kind of swinging back around.
Interesting. Yeah, it's so I enjoyed the All In Pod interview of Trump as well yesterday. And one thing that struck me, and I'd love to get your input on as a comms expert, was after the interview, the besties, they were, kind of doing a debrief. And one of the arguments that Chamath was making was, see, like, you can see how reasonable he is, Trump was in the interview. And there's this narrative that he's this crazy wild man, hateful person, but obviously we just spent an hour with him and he was super calm and thoughtful and businesslike or whatever. And what occurred to me was like, yes, and I've also seen Trump at his own rallies, and he brings a different mask to those rallies than, and I don't, maybe what we saw in All In was like kind of the more real Trump, but either way, do you think that's a risk for Trump? Because I think if a lot of his hardcore supporters watch that interview where he's saying, hey, I want unlimited green cards for anyone that has a 2-year degree, that doesn't sound like a Trump rally kind of greatest hits. What are your thoughts on how a candidate, he seems to be like adapting for the audience effectively in this case, but do you think that's a good strategy? Like, will he be able to manage that? Because he's kind of talking out of both sides a little bit.
I think it was a very calculated decision. I think if we look at the audience of that podcast and who it reaches and all of those things, the idea that it would spill over immediately or very effectively into the audience who wouldn't love to hear those points, I think is rightly pretty low. And in the meantime, he'll have put out 10 other different statements to the contrary. And so he's now given these people who he frankly needs a little bit of bait and a hook, and they bought it. And he will, of course, go back to what he's doing at rallies. I think that expecting this leopard to change his spots at this point in his life is highly unlikely. He's going to keep being Trump in public as we know him. But I do think it was a very, very smart move. I think providing this particular audience with this bit of fodder was critical. And to your point also about demeanor, so much of communications is not what you say, it's how you say it. And he definitely took that approach in this interview, and he took it well. And I think that he's likely doing very similar things behind closed doors.
Yeah, which makes him quite formidable as a candidate. He isn't like entirely the wild man. He's playing his cards pretty smartly. What's your take on the Biden comms performance so far? We talked about he had a very strong State of the Union, but other than that, I haven't seen a whole lot of winning moments from him, and I'm guessing the team that's intentional, that they're just avoiding a bad clip versus trying to generate good clips.
I think that they're in a really tough position because at this point, people are actively looking for what they're doing wrong. There are far fewer people who are going into a Biden appearance and saying, he did that one moment so well. That was a beautiful moment. They're much more likely to take something like, for example, I don't know if you saw, there was a recent service that he attended where he went to sit and there was no chair behind him. And Jill informed him that there was no chair behind him. And I think it went over Twitter that like, oh, it looked like he was defecating himself or something to that effect. Oh. And so, yeah. And so people are really, really looking for any reason to say, that's an old man, he shouldn't be running for president. And they aren't doing it to Trump in the same way. And that's a huge problem. And I think that this is another point that a lot of Democratic strategists have brought up time and time again. Democrats are so much more willing to cannibalize their own and to point out the faults in their own. And I think that there is some merit to it. It means that in theory, we should be getting stronger candidates because we're looking at everything very critically. But if the other side's not doing it and the other side has built these echo chambers where they're constantly promoting within themselves all of the benefits of their party and the people that their party's speaking to. And of course, I'm referencing here like Fox News or the other publications on that side of the spectrum. We see that a lot less in Democratic spaces, and it makes it very challenging. In addition, there have been reports that there are some issues happening in the communications department on the White House side of things. I've seen a number of reports that they're not quite thrilled with the press secretary at all levels, that they might be trying to replace her, but that of course she doesn't want to go. No idea if those reports are true or not. I don't talk to them. However, it's not instilling confidence to read that in every publication. And it is gossip. It's definitely gossip, but who leaked it? Why are they leaking it? Why are we seeing it in the way we're seeing it? I think that these are all important questions to be thinking about as we're trying to diagnose what's wrong with the Biden White House and campaign's communications, because it's clear that they are dealing with issues on both levels.
Yeah. So does he have, I guess he has two comms teams, one for the campaign and one for the presidential job. And then, yes. Oh, wow. Yeah, that must be challenging.
Yeah. And I mean, you run into it with every office when someone's running, but also working. We had it with the Dean campaign as well. You know, I was handling things on the election side of things. I only ever do elections. I don't do government. I do elections because it is different work. It's definitely different work. There are those who make the transition. I have not, and I don't think I will. But we had on the other side of things a full team that was in his congressional office who, of course, would get inquiries about the election and who would have to say, I actually cannot tell you anything about that. Please talk to Katie.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a pain point there. But then in addition, you know, we can't know what he's doing on a policy side to a complete extent. And so sometimes the policy side would need him for an important announcement that we would then have to play catch up on, and it would be very confusing. And this happens, like I said, for every elected official, because we are not allowed to be using state resources, federal resources on an election. Yeah.
Yeah. What a complex kind of process that is.
I think it's a good one, though. I do think it's an important one. We shouldn't be spending state resources on elections as we currently play them. I think it's correct.
Yeah, I remember when for the 2020 election, I was kind of surprised that so many of the Trump kind of re-election events seemed to be like hosted on like federal grounds, and it was
there was
blurred
a lot about the Hatch Act and whether it was violating that. Yeah, it's definitely an issue, and I think an important one. If you are a sitting president and you're hosting a lot of election-related things, using government funds, it gives a certain image, and a lot of times image is everything. So it's tough. It's definitely tough.
Let's talk about this alternate universe where you're on the comms team for Donald Trump.
Oof.
What advice would you give DJT going into Thursday? What should he do? Should he bring out the all in podcast Trump, or should he bring out the the rally kind of rabble rouser Trump, or some combination? Like what's his game plan? What should it be?
Well, first and foremost, he does have to also avoid a senior moment.
Yeah.
It's an issue on both sides. He really needs to make sure that he is not having any sort of slip ups or faux pas of
Mhm.
that sort, and it could very well happen. And so that's definitely got to be a concern on that team. I think I would like to see him thread that needle between being a more reasonable person and
Mm.
still having that rabble rousing spirit. I think populism works. It does. Populism has been an effective way to rally support. And so I don't think he can let go of that. But I do think as we're looking at this moderate part of the country who's wavering a bit, if he presents a more reasonable front, I'm not happy with Biden. Why shouldn't I just vote for Trump? And so I think that he has a real opportunity here to try to gain some of that middle ground back that he's already gained back. We're seeing it. These numbers aren't new.
Mhm.
And I do think Biden has a lot more to lose from this debate than Trump, unfortunately. I think that as reasonable as Biden can make himself look, if Trump in any way, shape, or form is actually exuding the sort of reasonable character that we saw on the All In podcast, he could make substantial growth. Because the reality is his base is going to stand by
Right.
him. He's done a great job cultivating that base. And yeah, he should give them like little nuggets, but they're also not really the ones necessarily that the debate is for. They're already convinced. So
Yeah.
what's he going to do to convince that middle?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the All In Pod was the start of his pivot to the center. I mean, I was so kind of a little disappointed because I was like, oh, he's doing a smart thing here that's going to help him. Like when he was like, oh, I'm not for a national ban on abortion, just leave it to the states. I'm for massive increases in legal immigration. I was like, oh, he's totally like, you know, moving to the center, and that's going to help him. Um yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens on Thursday. On one scenario, do you think there's any route where on Thursday, if Biden has a terrible, terrible, terrible night, is there time for the Democratic Party to evaluate alternatives?
Oh, uh, technically, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They could absolutely try to do some finagling, get someone else in there. I think realistically, it would be very challenging. Going back to a point I made earlier, we have done a not great job of building out our bench.
Mm-hmm.
The heir apparent to Biden is not so apparent. I think obviously Kamala would be the next logical choice, but polling wise, is she the next logical choice? I'm sure Gavin Newsom would love to throw his hat into the ring. I'm sure
Yeah.
Pritzker would love to throw his hat into the ring. Whitmer, I'm sure, would love it. I know, give it 8 years, you're going to see Governor Shapiro out of Pennsylvania throwing his hat into the ring.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, it's not clear. And that uncertainty is very dangerous. And I do think that the Democrats are taking, to use another petty phrase, the bird in hand. This is a known quantity, and unknowns right now terrify them. And I get it. I do. I think it's really hard to take a risk right now when they know that so much is at stake. But of course, if Biden does perform particularly bad, there's going to be a lot of outside pressures beyond party leadership then. And that'll be another consideration point.
So let's say he literally like faints or falls over or just has like a McConnell like 30-second pause. I mean, something devastating. I would hope would be like clearly a existential challenge for the campaign. Then is it a fait accompli that it's Kamala that is kind of next in line? She's the VP, or do you think there's a space for a conversation about maybe a Whitmer or someone else, maybe a Whitmer Newsom combo?
I think that they'd have to have a conversation. I really do. I think that it's going to be really hard to argue to a Democratic base who at this point feels shoehorned into Biden to begin with. They're already pretty uncomfortable with the idea of it being Biden. We look at the protest votes that were happening in the primary. Yeah, okay, Marianne Williamson, Dean Phillips didn't break through. There were a lot of people who voted uncommitted and a lot of people voting, for Palestine and things of that nature. So I think that if they just told people what was happening, there would be a lot of adverse reactions, especially if folks didn't have a chance to acclimate themselves to the idea that there's something new happening. I think that it would be a mistake. Doesn't mean that it's not what they're going to do. That Democrats love making mistakes. But I think it would be a big mistake to just knight someone the future president of the United States. I think that that's a huge missed opportunity to engage with the base.
Yeah. And if you have that conversation, then you'd have to answer the question from parts of the party that would say, are you serious? We had our first African-American woman VP, and she's been a loyal partner and she was selected by Biden, and you're taking it away from her for potentially a white lady or a white man, and that's BS.
Well, I think that's why it has to be a conversation. I think that it can't feel like the Democratic Party is just forcing someone into the nomination. I think that it would be not only a missed opportunity to engage in real conversation, but to engage in, even if it was just the electors at this upcoming convention who decided that they're going to just vote for someone new. I think that they have to have that level of debate, if only because, and this was a huge point of frustration for me personally over the course of the Dean Phillips campaign, this notion that debates and primaries in any way, shape, or form weaken candidates is ridiculous. The idea that having a conversation where people bring up valid criticisms necessarily means that the product that they're criticizing is weaker because of those criticisms is absolutely ludicrous. And I think it's a huge issue as we think about preserving our democracy. We're having all these questions about, the Republican Party, they might be bringing about the end of democracy. Well, if we're eliminating debate, we're doing the same thing. So I think we have to be very, very careful about setting ourselves up for this like hypocrisy of democracy. I know Dean was saying it and it was a pithy line and whatever, and he came up with it. This wasn't my line. But I do think that it's a very real issue. We have to make sure that we're walking the talk here.
Yeah. Well, that would make for an extremely exciting convention in Chicago.
It certainly would.
That would be so cool. I would love that as a political junkie. I
don't think it's going to happen. I think that Biden will do either just fine at this debate or maybe okay. And I think Trump will also likely do just fine at this debate. I think most people won't know that it happened. I don't think there will be many clippable moments outside of probably a gaffe here or there. And I think that once again, the American people will continue to sleepwalk towards November. I think that that's the most likely scenario.
Yeah. And if you play out sort of the game theory options, maybe both of them just want a so-so debate and avoid taking any excessive risks because they have more to lose.
There's definitely a possibility. I think certainly on the Biden side, there's a huge, huge downside if they do not do this debate well. Trump, unlike Biden, I think is a lot more secure on his base. I really don't think that there's going to be any kind of pressure if Trump, for some reason, has a Trump moment. They kind of expect him to have Trump moments. In contrast, if Biden slips, I do think that it could be a huge problem for him. And so they have to play things very carefully. Of course, flip side, if it's a small slip, once again, we're talking about the debate. I go out on the streets. I don't hear much about the debate. I don't know that many people are actually paying attention, which is wildly concerning also, especially for the Democratic Party. But it gives them a little bit more wiggle room.
Yeah, that doesn't speak well to the Democratic turnout in November if people aren't paying attention by now. I mean, it's almost July.
I think that we should be very, very concerned about turnout this election.
Yeah.
I think between what's happening in Israel and Gaza, understandably, I think that there will be many people who may not vote this November, especially if things keep going on the trajectory that they're going. I was talking to someone about this the other day. It's kind of crazy if you're from Palestine and in the United States and voting to say you have to vote for this man who is providing weapons to the man who is committing genocide against your friends and family. You have to vote for him. I think that that's just an ask that's far too high. And I think we will see people choose to not vote this upcoming November rather than vote for a person they also hate. That's not to say that any of these people like Donald Trump, but it's hard when there's genocide on the other side of things. That's a very, very challenging position. And I really don't think that you can be angry at those voters because they've been put in a very difficult position without options that really appeal to them in any way, shape, or form. I think flip side, the Democrats also have not done the community building that they were doing going into 2020. We saw huge strides in states like Georgia because of very, very active community work that we're hearing a lot less about this cycle. And that could also be another huge problem. I don't know if you remember, Yang actually went to Georgia.
I remember.
A whole bunch of us down there.
Yeah.
I say us. I didn't go down to Georgia, unfortunately. But there was a very concerted effort.
Yes. All hands on deck in Georgia. Yeah.
And, maybe they put something together, but I haven't seen the same focus on community building that we saw in 2020. And I do think that that's concerning.
We didn't talk about RFK and Stein. Do you think there'll be a strong third party kind of turnout in November, or what do you think that'll look like?
I think it's hard to say at this point in time, just because this election is a little more nebulous than I think it should be at this point. I think a lot of voters, as we mentioned before, aren't thinking about it as closely as they should be. And I do think opinions will shift the closer we get to November. I think October is going to be a very critical month, as it always is leading up to an election. This is nothing new. But I think looking at where they stand now, I don't know that RFK is actually drawing that many votes from Biden. I don't know that RFK is, in fact, a Biden opponent, or he's a Biden opponent. I don't know that he's going to be siphoning votes. Jill Stein, on the other hand, I think if she breaks through, I think if she starts building up momentum, now that could be a really big problem for Democrats. Jill Stein, I think, is presenting a lot of opinions that would appeal to the progressive base that are frankly really struggling with what the Biden administration has done or failed to do, as the case may be. Issues like student loans, that was a mess. We don't talk about it as much anymore, but what happened with student loans was an absolute mess and really left a lot of Americans feeling like they had been let down by their government. I think with the climate, obviously, that's always going to be an issue. And I don't think that the Biden administration has done enough articulating the good work that they've done on the climate. And so I think that Jill Stein could be a real factor if she manages to start building up her profile.
Yeah. I had her on the show just yesterday, and I was so impressed by her.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all over 70, but she seems the most put together. She had a mastery of the facts. She was making logical arguments. We were able to talk about multiple policy areas. And she has a very clear position on Gaza that is different than RFK and Biden and Trump's.
And I think that that's really important for her. I think that she made a very smart decision. And I'm sure it was more than a smart decision. I'm sure she also believes it, but that was a very good choice on her part. That said, of course, I don't think either of them could win. There's no world that we have a Jill Steiner and RFK as president. Third parties are not set up to win in the US, but they could siphon votes for sure.
Yeah. Last thing we could talk about before we wrap is what's your, since it's 2024, we have to talk about AI.
Yeah.
What's your take on the impact or potential impact of AI on how politics and communications will work? I'm guessing you think about that a lot.
I do. And in fact, the companies I'm working with now on the tech side of things are actually very focused on this issue. Groups like Credo AI, RIL are very honed in on the question of how do we use AI safely and responsibly and ethically. I think it's very, very easy and appropriate to draw lines to the 2016 election where social media was used to absolutely impact the outcome. And this is just the latest thing that will do that. As you and I saw in New Hampshire already, AI has played a role in this election. While a random consultant, what was it that he did? He contacted someone in New Orleans, a street magician, and got him to create a Biden deepfake. While that did not move the needle in any meaningful way in New Hampshire, if it was able to be done by a street magician in New Hampshire or in New Orleans, imagine what Russia could do with AI to impact this election. I think that we all need to be very vigilant as we're approaching this election, both as individuals and then anyone who's working in the field of AI. Make sure that your tool has safeguards built in, that it can't be used by bad actors. I think it's really, really critical that you have a plan to identify risks and move on them quickly. And then flip side, as voters, I think it's really, really critical that we look hard at every piece of information that we're receiving online and take a second. I would encourage everyone to go to the Poynter Institute to read about their MediaWise program and how they approach misinformation and disinformation. So to summarize it, stop for a second when you see a piece of information, think, is this making me react emotionally? Oftentimes, misinformation and disinformation is designed to cause an emotional trigger within you that makes you share it faster, because misinformation and disinformation is most powerful when it's shared rapidly. So take a second, stop, think about it, go onto your browser. I don't know if you're using Google, Safari, whatever, Bing. Does anyone use Bing? Is Bing even still here? And search what
I think it exists.
Yeah. Search what you just heard and then click on every reputable article that's referencing it and do what's called horizontal reading. So you don't need to read things too in depth, but look for common facts. And if you're seeing across all of these reputable sources, everyone's saying the same thing, great. That's real information. Go, share it, talk about it, do whatever you want to do. But if you're not seeing that verification, don't share it right away. Give it a second. Wait for people to really dig into it and process it, because that's how we stop the spread of disinformation.
Yeah, that reminds me. I remember there was a clip floating around on Twitter, video clip of Biden like visiting some store, and he was like really looking frail and old. And then I later looked at the full video of that visit, and I realized, oh, this clip, the speed was changed to make him look like he was like robotically slow.
Yeah.
And it's just like, but you have to do the work to open up another tab and look versus just kind of go with your instincts and hit repost.
And it's tough. It's not easy. I mean, this is so effective for a reason. They've found the code. They've done it. Misinformation is designed so well to make us want to share it. And that's why it's such a huge issue. And it's not just AI, to your point. There exist other forms of misinformation and disinformation. And unfortunately, the onus is on us as voters and active participants in society to try to use our best judgment to figure it out. And that sucks. It sucks that there's not an easy way to fix this. But unfortunately, we are the solution.
Actually, we have a question in the live chat from Jeremy. What happened to the Dean Phillips AI chatbot? It was up for like a day and then disappeared. Do you remember
I do.
Have you? Yeah.
That was I had a lot of moments on the campaign that caused me panic. It was I didn't have a lot of sleep on that campaign, and so this was one of those moments that I briefly was like, oh my god, there's a chatbot deep faking Dean Phillips. I was not expecting this today. This wasn't on the comms plan. Well, so it was put on by one of the super PACs that was advocating for Dean Phillips' election, which means that because it was done via super PAC, we actually had absolutely no coordination with them and didn't, number one, know that it was coming. And when it went away, we found out when everyone else found out that it went away. But my understanding from articles that I read, OpenAI very quickly realized that it was a violation of their terms of service. So they did is actually exactly what we're talking about right now for tech companies to be doing. They have guardrails put up on their program, and they saw that someone was breaking one of those guardrails and they took action. And so that's great. It would have been lovely if they had caught it a little sooner, but also this is a brand new frontier. And I think that taking it down within like a day or two is great. It was very needed. We appreciated it. Thank you for taking it down. Because we had absolutely no control over it. We had no idea what it might say. Could it be made to say things that would be super damaging to us? We had no idea. And of course, that unknown is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, totally. Like hallucinations for a political candidate's chatbot take a whole new level of risk.
And it sounded exactly like him. I was sitting with him in the car and he was asking it questions. And there was like a couple moments where I had to pause for a second because I wasn't looking at him. And I was like, is it the phone or is it Dean? And it was really, really crazy what a powerful piece of technology it was.
Yeah. And, that stuff will only get better. It's when you talk about responsible AI, I mean, if you look at what OpenAI, Gemini or Anthropic are saying, they all talk about how they're trying to be super safe and responsible. Is your view that they're not doing enough, or what's your thoughts on that?
I think that it's really hard for companies that are forging new technology to necessarily be perfectly responsible and ethical at the time that they're forming it. We saw it with Facebook, we saw it with Twitter, we see it with all of these social media sites. Asking them as they're building something to be thinking about every possible way that it can be misused, to foresee things that they don't have any insight into yet is really, really challenging. And so I think that it's really critical that while we're building these tools, which I think are so important, the fact that we are making such huge strides in AI is fantastic. As a fan of Andrew Yang, I certainly believe that AI could be a wonderful tool for humanity. And I'm thrilled that we're seeing it really start pushing forward the way that it is. Obviously, it's not going to take over anyone's jobs yet. It's not there yet. That's for sure. But it's a great augment tool for so many professions already. Accountants can use AI for incredible things. I was working with a company on it recently and I was absolutely blown away. Lawyers too. Contracts, AI plus contracts is absolutely incredible. But I think we need to, while we're building these tools, also separately have a parallel path of building governance and ethical guardrails and safety. And there are companies doing it. I do think that it is a place also for regulation from governments. I think that the EU AI Act was a very important first step. I think that the US also needs to be making similar strides there. And I know we've talked about it and we're starting to put pen to paper there, but I really think we need to move faster. Because we don't want to have what happened with Facebook in 2016 happen now in 2024 with AI.
Yeah, well, we are in historic times for sure on the political side, on the technology side. So it's going to be a crazy year, no doubt. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Katie. Was there anything else that you want to share? How any projects you're working on, or how people can follow you?
Yeah, I am working at a company called Command right now. So if if you work at a tech startup or a political campaign, you're looking for some comms help, please feel free to reach out, cmand.co. And then I'm on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. Unfortunately, I think both are still branded. I was on a game show briefly, and so both are still branded from my time on a game show. But don't worry about it. That was a while ago. I just haven't updated things yet. But certainly always happy to help. If you are actually also looking to start a campaign, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to engage with new candidates and see if there's anything I can do to help lift you up as you're starting out, because it is hard. It's a challenging thing to do. But when you determine that it's the right fit for you and for your community, the work you're doing is service. It's a public service. And so I will always greatly admire those who choose to go that route.
And does Command work both with tech startups and political campaigns, or?
I strong arm them into some campaigns every now and again, but it is mostly for tech startups, VCs, and nonprofits.
Love it. And for a tech startup that's looking for comms help, like what kinds of things does Command do?
Yeah. So we are a full service communications firm, which means that we offer support for PR, general strategy, messaging, media training, everything that you would expect from a communications firm. And then we also have other things that we can add on and help with, like social media, analyst relations. I've been doing a lot of work with analyst relations recently. And we do things both on a long-term partnership scale. So we will work with your company for years if you'll let us, but also if you're just working on a project and you raised a great seed and you want people to know about it, we'll help you launch your seed, and then we'll say goodbye, good luck, and let us know if you need more help down the line. So a little bit of mix of longer term projects, shorter term projects, mostly in AI, fintech, and developer tools.
Love it. I see my two podcast worlds colliding. I'll have to get you on my Fireside Product Management podcast. Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Absolutely. Would certainly love to talk, especially if you know any founders who are looking to start really examining how they approach communications. It's one of my favorite things to do. I love working with startups for that reason. Just the possibilities there are so wonderful. And working with people who are building tools is one of the coolest things.
Indeed. 100% agree. Well, thank you so much, Katie. It's been a pleasure having you in the Nerd Zone. Absolutely. And I feel like it's a long time coming, given the start of the channel being with Yang's presidential campaign and covering, poll numbers back in the old days. So it's good to see you.
What an arc. Thank you so much for having me, Tom. I really, really appreciate it. Always a joy to talk with you. And hopefully I'll see you soon.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. Take care, Katie.
All right, bye.
Bye. All right, Katie Dolan, super smart lady. I can attest that I remember being in New Hampshire working on some text message campaigns. And, you get these questions about this policy or that policy. And whatever I asked her, she always had a very quick, clear, concise answer. And I was like, damn, she knows a lot of stuff. So good on her. Glad to see that she's doing well. I'm going to share some more thoughts on our conversation overall. But as you know, I got to give a shout out to the people who make this channel possible, which is our channel members. And if you're not a member, it costs $1.99 at the entry level. It's hopefully something worthwhile. It helps cover the streaming software costs, the podcast hosting fees, which if you like to listen to audio podcasts, make sure you subscribe and leave a review for Nerds for Humanity. So who are our members? We're going to start with our biggest member, which is our senior vice president level. And that is none other than Soldier One. So let me share my screen. Soldier One has been supporting the channel for 50 months, over 4 years. Then we've got Kristen Slevin and Bike. Kristen is at 53 months of support. Bike 43 months. Amazing. It's because of people like this that I keep this channel going. It's not the biggest channel on the internet, but since I know there's this collection of members who are, literally helping me cover the cost. I'm like, okay, yeah, let's keep it going. I enjoy doing it. And, if it's useful. So at the hardcore level, we have Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Mr. History, Mona, Vaughn, Yang, Dean, Galessa, Jay Parandana, Jason, Daniel, Mickey, Yoda, Jackson, and Unkiyu. And at the entry level, in order of time as member, I'm going to scroll through these amazing people. Thank you all for your support and for supporting this channel and helping us keep producing this content. All right, so what are my top 3 takeaways? Number 1 was how either fraught or unimpactful Thursday's debate is going to be. It's fraught because if Biden has a senior moment, it's going to be very hard for him to recover. We'll see that moment replayed in every ad that Trump and Trump super PACs have until November. If Biden has a great moment, it will help, but it won't be a game changer. He'll need more of them. He's kind of has a trust deficit with a lot of undecided voters. So that's why if he stumbles, he really kind of takes it in the shorts. But if he has a good night, it's kind of like the State of the Union. Like people will be like, okay, yeah, he had that one good night. And now they'll say, oh, he had the State of the Union. He had a pretty good debate. So it'll help him. Whereas for Trump, yeah, he wants to avoid a senior moment, but in a way, a senior moment for Trump seems more acceptable because people will just say, wow, he's Trump. He's crazy. He's saying crazy things. He's just hyperbole. He's exaggerating. He did that on purpose. Trump is playing 4D chess. You haven't taken the red pill. You don't understand. So I think if Trump has a senior moment, it's not as harmful to Trump as it would be to Biden. If Trump has a solid night, I think a lot of undecideds might be like, and solid, I would describe as more like the all in podcast Trump, not the sweating, screaming rally Trump. And I think Katie made a good point, which is like, Trump may not need to bring out the sweating, screaming, orange rally Trump because his base is there for him. So now Trump has a win over the suburban voters, the Republicans who might have been for Nikki Haley, or the Democrats who are uncomfortable with Biden's performance on the border. If he can win those over, I mean, let's remember, Biden didn't exactly win by landslide last time, so every vote counts. So that was takeaway 1, which is how this could be devastating for Biden, but most likely both of them will play it safe. Trump because he wants to not appear crazy, and Biden because he wants to avoid a catastrophic moment. The second takeaway is like, oh, if Biden had a catastrophic moment, how exciting that would be, because I think the Democratic Party would have an opportunity to consider a backup quarterback to get on the field. And then the debate would be like, well, is the best backup quarterback Kamala Harris? Is it Gretchen Whitmer? Is it Gavin Newsom? Is it Deval Patrick? Like, who is it? So that's I know that's unlikely, but man, wouldn't that be interesting? And then I think the third takeaway is our discussion about the unattractiveness of citizens running for office. That it's like, wow, you got to do all this work. You got to take all these arrows. You got to spend all this time and all this hours. And then you get to a system that's almost impossible to change. And yet people do it. And I think there are 2 kinds. I think there are the kinds that do it, maybe 3 kinds. There's the kind that do it for hubris or, vanity. There's a kind that do it out of service. And probably the most common is the third category, which is a little bit of a combination of both. But yeah, it's a hard call. I personally can't can't uh can't quite square that circle on why I would ever want to put my name out there, at least for a big office. Just seems like you can be more helpful to society and humanity in other ways. On the other hand, if you could play a role in helping with gerrymandering reform or climate or education or healthcare, even if it was just one little thing, like that would be quite a privilege to be able to do something good for your fellow citizens and for the species. So let me know what you thought of the conversation with Katie below, and really appreciate you all. Oh, I forgot the closing music. All right, we'll do this a little bit. Yeah. So those are my 3 takeaways. If you can't become a member because you're like, hey, Tom, I like what you do, but I don't like it that much to spend money supporting your streaming software costs or podcast hosting fees or, thumbnail image editing tools. The next best thing you can do is just hit the like button, smash it, and then comment and share. Costs you nothing, and it helps people discover the channel, and hopefully what you thought was a useful conversation with Katie Dolan, former comms team member from the Yang 2020 campaign and comms lead for the Dean Phillips presidential campaign. And I think she might have been the lead for the Yang one as well. So hopefully you all have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye, nerds.